as you enjoy this episode today, John and I would like to take just a moment and invite you to consider becoming a sponsor of the podcast. For just a couple of pounds or dollars a month, you could help us ensure that we can keep this show free and available to everyone. We've just crossed 100 episodes of Two Texts and have several thousand listeners per month. So if just a few of you could commit to partner with us, that would be massively helpful as we continue to produce the content you've come to love. If you want to become a sponsor, simply visit twotexts.com or follow the links in the show notes. Thanks for letting us interrupt you. We'll let you get back to enjoying the show now. Hi there, I'm David Harvey, and I'm here with John Andrews, and this is the Two Texts podcast. In this podcast, we're two friends in two different countries, here with you every 2 weeks talking about two different texts from the Bible. In this season, as we enter our second year of podcasting together, we step beyond the stories of Jesus in the Gospels and into the book of Acts. The book of Acts is a series of stories and events from the early church when they encounter the disrupting presence of the Holy Spirit.
So David, we're back, and I so enjoyed our previous reflections on Saul, the Damascus, that introduction of the timeline that we looked at. If any of our listeners have missed that one and you've jumped straight into this, it's definitely worth going back one and having a wee listen on that. I think it really set the context not only of Paul's timeline for us, but really showed us the weight that's on this man. And in some ways, we're now getting a little bit of a sense. We're following something that's going to be very interesting here, as far as the Book of Acts narrative is concerned. And we sort of left him at Damascus, growing stronger and stronger, baffling his opponents, introducing the One, the Christ, the Son of God, this name that the disciples are calling on, all of those gorgeous connectors that you reflected on. And then we find him making his way to Jerusalem, and we get this, he escapes out of Damascus. And then after some time, and we sort of discussed the fact that was a 3-year gap, he's now in Jerusalem. So should we pick that little bit up and have a little reflect on what went on at Jerusalem?
Yes, and clearly everybody's struggling a little bit with Paul or Saul. In fact, everybody's struggling with him. The the people who don't believe in Jesus are like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And the people who do believe in Jesus are not entirely, like that line in verse 26 of Acts chapter 9. He comes to Jerusalem, he tries to join the disciples, but they're all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. The level of mistrust that Saul has clearly been creating is that somebody at least is thinking, what if he's just pretending to be a disciple so that he can infiltrate our ranks, something we know that happens in oppressive regimes around the world. So I think this is the fascinating journey for Saul, because he has become a traitor and therefore is considered untrustworthy on both sides, which is fascinating and I think believable. Like when I read this part of the story, that makes 100% sense to me. That I think I would say, as a Pauline scholar, as somebody that spends more than enough time thinking about Paul, I think if I was those disciples, I would have asked exactly the same question.
Of course.
I'd be like, maybe not this guy.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You totally understand. And doesn't it show you again, even with the time gap, the impact he must have made?
Yes.
So on our last podcast, we reflected that there's possibly this 3-year time gap between this sort of Damascus experience and arriving in Jerusalem, and they're still nervous about him. So this man must have really raised serious trouble as a persecutor of the way, because 3 years down the track, they're still nervous about him in the context of that. And yet I love this idea, David. I love the language of the NIV around this. It says he tried to join the disciples.
Yes.
So we in our last podcast, we reflected on the fact that Paul probably had this sort of 3-year gap where he's studying, he's learning, he's receiving revelation. There's even a sense in which he may even be suffering and wrestling with certain issues within these great moments of revelation that he's receiving. But he doesn't stay there in this place of aloneness or isolation. I'm sure he was surrounded by Christian community even there. But he now understands, right, if I'm going to be able to fulfill what God has called me to fulfill, I've got to join what is going on. I've got to find a way to connect to the Christian community at Jerusalem because of its influence and significance. And I cannot stay aloof from that. And I love this his compulsion to join, this to be glued to them, to be connected to them. And I think that's a great, I think there's a great encouragement to us as followers of Jesus, that although many of our experiences can be very personal, intimate, individual in many ways, a personal experience of Jesus and a personal experience in the Word, that even with Paul now in his great moments of revelation, he still seeks to be joined to community, and he still seeks to be joined to the apostles. And I love that little. I love the language around that. I thought that was really, really nice, and a nice little nod to that.
And of course, this little window again, just to speak to the chaos of Saul's life. If we remember in the last episode, we were overlaying 2 Corinthians and Galatians at times. But, he stays with them in Jerusalem, moves around freely, speaks boldly in his name, and then they try and kill him. Paul tells us in Galatians this was a 15-day period. So, he got into trouble really, really quickly. It's like he disappears off the map for 3 years in Arabia, comes back, and 2 weeks later, they're like, oh, no, okay, Paul, you need to go somewhere else because you're going to get in trouble. And so,
it really is striking, isn't it? It's amazing.
I think it was Tom Wright that said, whenever Paul went anywhere, there appeared to either be a revival or a riot. And Tom makes this beautiful stage. He said, and whenever I go anywhere, they just serve tea.
Love that.
But in between all of that, not to skip over it, so they were all afraid of him, not believing he was really a disciple. But Barnabas. Come on. Barnabas. Talk to me about Barnabas.
I love this. And I know some of our listeners who've tracked this for a long time will know I've got a bit of a thing about Barney. He is one of my heroes, I have to say. And of course, we've met him before in Acts 4. We spent a fair bit reflecting on this amazing man who liquidates asset and gives his assets and lays them at the apostles' feet. And it's just absolutely beautiful. And you have this moment of tension in the text, this incredible moment, verse 26, but they were afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. So he's tried to join the disciples. They're not convinced he is a disciple. And then what's going to happen? But Barnabas. And you get this gorgeous interventory moment from this amazing, amazing man. And I don't know if this is maybe the preacher in me now, David, but I'll notice the gorgeous language over the two verses, 26 and 27. Barnabas took him, brought him or led him, and then told them about him, essentially. These three actions: took, led, told. He's acting here as not just a brother in faith. He's acting as an advocate for Saul. He is literally putting his own reputation on the line on behalf of Saul. And I love this sort of language. He clearly knows the story of Saul intimately, because it says that he spoke of how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord, that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. So it's Luke is dropping this detail in because Barnabas has clearly done his work. He's done his research. He's checked out on this man. He's tracked his story. Wherever Saul has been for 3 years, Barney's got a handle on the story here. And he finds out this man's in Jerusalem and immediately steps into the breach of the hesitancy, the uncertainty, the sense of suspicion and fear. And Barnabas does something that changes, I think, the course of history. Because in stepping forward to advocate for Saul, he ensures that Saul doesn't go AWOL, that Saul doesn't get pushed out to the extremes, that Saul doesn't become this sort of edgy, agitator from the fringe, but Saul ends up becoming a mainstream player in the mission of the church. And that is all down to Barnabas. When I think of Saul's contribution to the New Testament, and I'm reading letters like Galatians and First Corinthians and Ephesians, I'm also sort of thinking about Barney. I'm thinking about, had Barney not stepped up, what would have happened to Saul? Now we believe in the providence of God to work it all out in the end, but Barnabas is a significant contributor here, and his action in no small way affects the future of the church and the mission of the church in the book of Acts.
And so just for our listeners, a couple of things. The episode we're referring to, if you need to find it again, is back as episode 20 of this series. So you can find that on the twotext.com website. You can go back and listen to episode 20 where we talk about Barnabas and how we know him in the story. So you may want to refresh your mind to that. I'll also put a link, John, to your book that we talked about in a podcast last year in our couple of bonus episodes. You spend a bit of time talking about Barnabas in the life of John Mark, don't you? And so I'll put a link to John's book in the show notes as well to help everyone just sort of perhaps jump in and connect to that. But I think what I love about this, and this is what I think in the bonus episodes we did last May about your new book, I think what you're seeing here is atypical Barnabas behavior. This is this incredible character who just sort of floats around on the edges of the New Testament story. He is acting exactly as we see when we see elsewhere. This is how Barnabas is, isn't it?
It's true. It's so true. And in fact, there's a gorgeous, but Barnabas took him. Exactly the same phraseology and language used of John Mark in Acts 15, where Paul says, no, the boy's not coming with us. And it says, and Barnabas took him. And you sort of think, is that Luke just giving a little tip of the hat there? And maybe when Saul or Paul reads Luke's words back again, he goes, oh yeah, Barnabas did that for me too, right? And this gorgeous symmetry of expression. He took John Mark, he took Saul, and I love this advocacy. For me, David, it's funny when we think about the Ephesians 4:11 ministry gifts, we've got named apostles, named prophets, named evangelists, and named teachers. Me and you, just off the top of our head, could come up with names for all of those categories in those 4:11 ministry gifts. If we wanted to try and name a pastor who's named as a pastor, shepherd, in the explicit sense, Paul the apostle or Paul the shepherd, we're sort of struggling a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think Barnabas, if I was creating a template for what a shepherd pastor looked like, I think Barney is the DNA that we want to get a hold of here. Because I think he, as you say, this is not exceptional behavior. This is now part of a patterned behavior, which will repeat itself on at least another 2 occasions, explicitly in the context of the Acts narrative. And Barnabas really, he's an amazing person for me, David, in that he seems to sit on the fringe of the story, and yet he cannot be ignored. His sort of wordage in the book of Acts is quite small, certainly compared to Paul. But yet, my goodness, he burns bright in the text,
doesn't he?
And stands out. And I, if we do get the chance to go to heaven and meet someone, I do want to have a coffee with Barney. I really do. I want to sit with him and just thank him for John Mark and thank him for this moment, because I think his contribution is incalculable.
I love what you said there as well about his pastoral heart, and I hope that the pastors that listen to us hear that. I think there's this immense pressure on pastors in the contemporary context to model their pastoral ministry on something which is not pastoral, right? And I've been reflecting a lot on this recently about how this pressure to be the CEO pastor, or to be the great leader of people pastor. And I think we want to confess that the New Testament model of pastor, which is a little sketchy at times, but, because I think my take on it is the reason the New Testament writers don't model pastor for us explicitly is because they assume that we will see Jesus as the true pastor.
Absolutely.
And so I think my suspicion from silence is that it never struck the New Testament writers that they would need to, and he is the good shepherd, so just go and do what shepherd, pastor is the same word. So I almost the sense of, you don't need us to unpack what the shepherd gift looks like, is go and do that. But I think because of that, we have inserted into the silence in the modern Western context for sure, our view of what a leader is, which is not the Jesus model. And I think we would all do much better to sort of just track Barnabas for a little while, read a little bit more of Jesus, and see this model of the pastor that cares for people, that shepherds people, that loves people, that, that I think it's Simon Chan, the Singaporean Pentecostal theologian, that says that we need to lean into the priestly model of the pastor, actually. That my role is to call and shape and draw these people into a beautiful journey with Jesus, not the CEO model that, hey, I'm here to run a church that you might come to. So I think there's some real beautiful stuff that you see. Look at Barnabas. He puts his neck on the line. He has to overwhelm the same questions that everybody else is overwhelming. Is this man really a disciple? And Barnabas decides that despite evidence, data, lack of support, he's going to gather with this person and draw them into the community. It's just gorgeous work.
It's stunning. And I think your reflection, David, is very, very powerful. And I think whoever's listening to us, if you find yourself in a leadership position, whatever your leadership structure and whatever your labels and whatever way we shape ourselves in running local churches, for example, we must never have the voice or the heart of the shepherd far from that conversation. Mm-hmm. So when the shepherd is excluded from conversations or part and excluded from even leadership culture and leadership structure, then the emphasis becomes about organization. It becomes about achieving things. Now, is it important for the church to achieve things and important for us to organize ourselves well? Of course, we're living in a modern context. We've got to do things well. But of course, our primary call is to grow people, not just develop brilliantly efficient organizations. Now I'll get criticized. People say, well, brilliantly efficient organizations are all part of growing people. Of course, as long as we keep the shepherds in the room, because the shepherds will keep reminding us that there's no point to structure and brilliant organization and fantastic programs if actually we're not growing people into followership of Jesus. And ultimately, the role of the shepherd is to help assist the process of growing strong sheep and growing strong followers. A man of God said to me years and years and years ago, and it has remained for me a constant guide. He said, son, and I was a young man at the time, and he was a seasoned man of God. He said, son, never lose the smell of sheep from off your clothes. And even as a teacher and someone who has the privilege of opening up the scriptures and getting to preach and teach in some wonderful contexts, I have to keep reminding myself of that my job is not just the text. My job is the sheep. And if I keep thinking sheep, I'll be better at the text. And if I keep thinking sheep, I'll be better at communicating that text. It's when I forget the sheep, then my communication and my gift becomes about excellence and brilliance and impressing people, and not actually about equipping people to be better followers of Jesus. So forgive me, listeners, if that sounds, I hope that hasn't come across in any way pious or pompous or superior. It's actually expressed with the deepest sense of humility in my heart. But I look at lots of leadership books that are coming out, even with a Christian genre, and shepherd is absent from the conversation. And I think that is a mistake that we must be careful not to allow to continue. So Barnabas appeals to us all and maybe continues to speak to us in the 21st century.
Well, I mean, I would want to say that strongly as well, John. It has been apparent to me for quite some time that the so-called Christian leadership movement that produces books and conferences and videos and all these sorts of resources almost entirely fail to wrestle with Jesus as a leader. And I think it exposes, and I've said this before, and I think I've said this before in this podcast, but I think it exposes a problem that what's actually going on here is we are looking at the models of leaders in wider society and trying to find examples within the Bible that reflect those models so that we can, and I say this in air quotes, that we can Christianize the what is essentially a secular model of leadership, and secular models of leadership are always about conquest and conquering, right? They're about how do I put the other competition out of business and do my thing. And a lot of people think that we, the church, have been called to conquer the world, that we've been called to take over the world. You think about the fight, we talk about this language of battle, not realizing that Jesus has come to save the world, not to conquer it. He's come to conquer evil, but he's come to save the world. And so we have to allow this dynamic, I think, of the good shepherd, it struck me as you were speaking there, what is Barnabas doing here? But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles, okay? Mm-hmm. You know what struck me when you were talking, and I'm looking at the verse while you're talking. I found myself thinking, Jesus said, a man once had 100 sheep, and one went missing. Did he not go look for that one and bring it and return it to? And was there not great celebration more for this one sheep that was lost than the 99 that did not get lost? Barnabas is in that little verse there, if you want to, is living out the parable of the lost sheep. He's putting his neck on the line, heading out into dangerous country to find that which is lost. And Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I am the good pastor, and I will lay down my life for the sheep. Like this is, like at a very basic level, you got to have enough smell of the sheep on you to be able to spot that one's gone missing. You know what I mean? So I think I love the way that you've brought that resonance to this, and I hope people don't think, oh, you're stretching it there, but I just love this, and it struck me as you were talking that Acts 9:27 and Barnabas' behavior is the parable of the lost sheep being acted out by the church. It's like Barnabas heard it and believed it.
Yes, totally. And again, David, there's a lovely echo back to Acts 4. He liquidates asset and brings it to the apostles. Now I know it's slightly different reflection there, but here's a man who not only is committed to the cause of mission, but he's committed to the cause of people.
So good.
So in liquidating his asset, he's saying, I believe in the mission to feed the poor, the mission to reach the lost, the mission to help the margins.
Jesus says, go sell everything you have and give it to the poor and come follow me.
There you are. So you're getting someone who, it seems to us, has picked up more of Jesus than sometimes we may even give him credit for it. We sort of think, well, he's come into faith after Jesus, sort of thing, but he's clearly caught Jesus seriously. Yeah. And to the point, he brings offering, and now he brings a person. And I love that. He's not just committed to this idea of mission, but now this is embodied in bringing a person to the apostles, because he believes in the restoration and transformation of people. And I love it. I think if you see those two little moments of bringing together, I think they're absolutely stunningly gorgeous. And Barnabas starts to emerge as a serious person within this text.
It's so good. It's so good. So then thinking then also in this about Saul, I mean, this is quite a complex time for Saul, actually, isn't it? Because somehow his life is in this very brief point sort of turning in on itself. He's far from home. He's now requiring help from the people he was sent to kill. You see this sense almost that he is being drawn deeply into the life of Jesus, actually, that he, as we see, becomes so true of Paul in his later life. He talks about being poured out as an offering for everyone. He talks about trying to model and imitate Jesus in his life. But here he finds himself quite quickly. He's in exactly the same space as Jesus was. He stays with them. Like I say, we know this is a 15-day period. He stays with them. He has a good time with the apostles, and we learn that from Galatians 1. He's speaking boldly in the name of the Lord, right?
Yeah.
And he's talking and debating. But as we saw with Jesus, as we saw with Stephen, this seems to have a trajectory to it.
It does. It does.
That I laugh nervously, not in the humor of it, but it seems to have a trajectory to it, that speaking about the name of the Lord is creating and generating difficulty. And so Saul now is part of that story.
Yeah, totally. And isn't it interesting, David, that in his bold proclamation, which is interesting, that it's the same sort of phraseology of Barnabas. Barnabas says he spoke boldly in Damascus, and then Saul goes out and speaks boldly in Jerusalem. There's this gorgeous synergy in the text there. But I love this, and I don't know if I'm overcooking this, David, so I'm going to throw it at you and then let you work it out. But it says he debated with the Hellenistic Jews, but they tried to kill him. Now, but before we get to the idea of trying to kill him, am I seeing something almost redemptive here? So I can't read that and not think of Stephen and Stephen's execution. Saul, I think, and Stephen were friends, so that we've discussed that before, so we're not going to go over that old ground again. Saul, coming from Tarsus, although educated in Jerusalem, would be extremely familiar with the sort of Hellenistic Jewish influence in Jerusalem and how zealous they were. But he would also have understood that it was essentially the Hellenistic group or groups of people that came together to sort of agitate for the execution of Stephen. So essentially, it seems it's the Hellenistic followers that kill Stephen. And yet Paul makes a beeline, or Saul makes a beeline for them. Now, there's a sense in which, that might be argued as a natural trajectory. He's going to groups of people he's had previous contact with, and therefore he's got an opportunity to speak to them. And I think that's all there. But for me, the fact that Luke highlights that, is this Saul going back to the group to whom he approved when they executed Stephen? Is this a full circle moment? Is this Saul trying to do something that maybe he feels he needs in memory of Stephen to force? Now, I can't prove that from the text. All I can allude to is the fact that why the Hellenistic Jews? Why not just the Jewish community in Jerusalem? But he goes specifically to them. And I think there's something slightly gloriously and beautifully redemptive here in this context that maybe Saul's trying to achieve. I could be overstretching that, David, so if I am, please feel free to put me back in the box on that one. But it seemed to sit out for me a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I suppose, despite Paul's arguments of being a Jew of Jews and a Pharisee of Pharisees, he is also, of course, not coming from Jerusalem. He's not coming from Israel. Yeah. So I'm just reflecting on his own status. So these are, some level, his people. There's clearly a tension between even right back to how do we end up with Stephen and the other deacons? We end up with them because of a tension around Hellenistic Christians and Hebrew Christians. I wondered when I was reading it, which really leads me to the same place as you, that when he's called to be this apostle to the Gentiles, Acts 10 is still coming, right? I wonder if there's an early sense of, well, let's start with the Hellenistic Jews. Yeah. But I'm also tempted to think that this is his community. So I think your point is really valid, that we don't want to ignore the fact that this story has just taken a huge circle. So we started, if you go back to chapter 8, we're in Jerusalem. Stephen is creating trouble amongst the Hellenistic Jews. Saul is there at the extermination of Stephen. And now here we are at the end of chapter 9, Saul having been sent out or chosen to go out, at least he's gone out with approval, to try and destroy more Hellenists. He's heading out to Damascus area, now ends up back with the Hellenists, him having changed, but apparently them having not. So there's definitely a cyclic loop going on there, and I can't believe Luke is very specific in verse 29 that he is debating with the Hellenistas, to use the Greek word there. He's not just talking about just generic followers of the way of Israel. He has a very specific group in mind that Saul is engaging with. So I think is a beautiful resonance, John, of this possibility that Saul is back where he started, but in this second time round, he has been changed, and isn't that the story of Jesus, that we keep going round? I was actually, a little side note, but I was involved in a retreat this past weekend, and we were talking about the liturgical calendar that we do. And depending, every Christian follows the liturgical calendar just at different extents. So you've got your very basic followers, that we use Christmas and Easter, and then you have your more advanced followers who are like Advent and Lent and Trinity Sunday and Pentecost and all these sorts of things. But the idea of the liturgical year is that every year we start a new year, but we spent a whole year living through the story of Jesus. So although we think, are we going to start this again? But we have been changed in the process of this year.
Beautiful.
And I think, isn't that life? That if you follow the liturgical calendar, your new year starts at the beginning of Advent, somewhere around the end of November. If you live by the Roman calendar, it's January 1st. And we keep redoing January 1st. But if we're doing it well, we come back to January 1 in a better place than we were the previous January 1. And I kind of get this sense of this resonance here, that like, here we are, 2 chapters later from the Stephen story, and we're back in the same place.
Yes, absolutely.
But there's been change. Some of the characters have adjusted, and Saul has stepped into the ministry of Stephen. And now, where Stephen was the one arguing with these people, now the one who oversaw his death is back making the same argument for Stephen. And Stephen's work is not complete, but is it fulfilled in some way? In the life of Paul.
I think it's beautiful, and I think that's maybe what I was aiming. I think there's a harvest here of Stephen in this moment. I can't read this and not think Stephen. So I think something of the blood of Abel, the writer of the Hebrews says, cries out from the ground, and there's a sense in which is Stephen's blood now, has Stephen's blood seeded this amazing redemptive moment where Saul is now back with this community talking about Jesus. But then, of course, we get this gorgeous kickoff moment where Stephen was executed. Saul escapes and he's not killed. And then a new chapter begins. So Stephen doesn't get to see the explosion of the people of the way across the earth. But Saul, ironically, who tried to stop the explosion of those people across the earth, is now going to become one of the foremost protagonists of that explosion across the earth. But it's interesting, just as Stephen annoyed the Hellenistic group and they try to they did kill Stephen, Saul annoys them. And when word gets out that they're trying to kill him, then they get him out. So the church has clearly got smarter to this whole dynamic that look, martyrdom isn't the only option here. So I think the early church weren't afraid of martyrdom, and the fact that all of the apostles of the 12 post-resurrection ascension who are put in place in the beginning of Acts, all of them except John are martyred. I think that they're clearly not afraid of martyrdom, but it doesn't have to be the only option, and it doesn't have to be the first option. And where Stephen's martyrdom kicks off an incredible explosion of persecution and, ironically, expansion, we now get Saul avoiding martyrdom and being a protagonist for another phase of expansion, which we're about to see. And of course, it's wonderful that, again, a lovely little full circle bit there, David, which I think is not coincidental in the text, is that when the believers learned of this, they took him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus, which of course is where he's originally from, planted back in Gentile territory, and in no mean city. It's a serious city, is Tarsus. Yes. It's a strategic city. It's a famous city. It has an incredible history, and it has an incredible strategic significance for the Gentile world as far as the gospel is concerned. So you get this lovely kick off into a new thing. Instead of martyrdom, we've now got the opportunity to go again. My wee mother used to say, when I grew up in Belfast, she said, "He who fights and runs away lives to fight another day." So you get Saul running or being helped to run for the hills, but he starts again, and this incredible mission kicks off.
Oh, it's wonderful, John. And I'm thinking, like, as you were saying that, I think there's a beautiful thing that the verse 30, when the brethren or the brothers and sisters learned of this, they took him down to Caesarea and sent him off to Tarsus. And I get the impression that there's at least an allusion here that they have financed this. They did it. They sent him off. This is the same group that were like, you know what, we're kind of afraid of him. Let's not believe he's really a disciple. So Barnabas has done some phenomenal work in 15 days. But they've gone from, let's not talk to this guy, to let's figure out how to save his life at potentially our personal cost.
Very good. Love that.
So I think that's interesting. You said something just a moment ago that is not connected. What I'm about to say is not connected to anything in the text, but it strikes me as worthy of saying, coming out of just some teaching that I've been doing elsewhere. But you mentioned Abel, and as you mentioned Abel, I was like, oh yes, it's beautiful. You talked about Abel's blood crying out from the ground, right? So here's a little reflection that is, like I say, please don't go looking, anyone that's listening, for this directly in the text. Abel is the first person to die in Scripture. Stephen is the first martyr, the first person to die for Jesus in history. So we've got, so that's as close as I can make to a connection here, but let me just say this anyway. Hevel, Abel's name in Hebrew, vapor, right? His name means vapor, which is actually quite interesting because it rarely gets translated that way in Scripture. It more regularly gets translated as vanity. Yes. The King James translated it as meaningless. So there's this beautiful sort of thing where Ecclesiastes, and everybody that's had any exposure to church over the years knows the opening lines of Ecclesiastes. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. But the Hebrew, Hevel, says the teacher. Vapor, says the teacher. And this gives you the option of completely rereading Ecclesiastes. The teacher is not saying that life is meaningless. He's not even saying that life is vanity. What the teacher is saying is that life is vapor, that it is here for a while and then it is gone for a while. And as he works his way through the story, the teacher in Ecclesiastes is pointing out, you have this very finite space here. And you are, but then he says, and I love this, I mean, this is the first few verses of Ecclesiastes. So we are vapor. But then he says, a generation goes and a generation comes. It's a beautiful description of vapor, right? But the earth remains forever. The sun rises, the sun goes down and hurries back to the place where it rises again. And you see, like, just when you said this, Abel, I thought, isn't that what's happening here? That Stephen comes and Stephen lives out his witness in this little moment of vapor that he has. It sounds like maybe a dark ending to the podcast, and I hope people don't hear it that way. But the Stephen's life is so fleeting and so easily extinguished, like vapor, so easy. A little mist is so easy to go away, and yet the long arc of the Lord's plan means that here we are 2 chapters later. And the actual very person that extinguished the vapor of Stephen's life is now back with his own vapor, continuing in the way of the Lord, continuing the story. And it struck me, and I think one of the things that jumped into me, and I know that you didn't mean it this way when you said, that Stephen didn't live to see this. But if we then drop the story of Hebrews chapter 11 over this, the Hebrews writer would say to us, but all of these witnesses, these martyr is the word witness, all of these witnesses are now gathered round the throne of heaven, watching the story of God. That our lives may be vapor, but God's story is happening. And I don't know, that was, I mean, like I say, that's not in the text here of Acts 9, but it came to me through some other work that I'm doing at the moment that I felt it was poignant to share.
Yeah, gorgeous. And the only other little, I thought, a beautiful thought, which we should really land with, and the only other little thought I had as you were speaking was, of course, Abel loses his life to a man that is in conflict with God. That it's their view of God Jonathan Sacks refers to this as the first sort of religious murder, the first murder in the name of God, sort of thing. And it's interesting that, of course, Stephen loses his life in a religious, zealously context, and yet both men still speak, and somehow their death was not in vain for those who journey in faith. And I think it's a gorgeous moment of this reflection in the story that Saul, having witnessed the terrible execution of Stephen, now it seems picks up the baton of Stephen and runs for the rest of his life for the cause that he now seeks to expand.
Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed it. If you want to get in touch with either of us about something we said, you can reach out to us on podcast@twotext.com or by liking and following the Two Text Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you really did enjoy the episode, then we'd love it if you left a review or a comment where you're listening from. And if you really enjoyed this episode, why not share it with a friend? Don't forget that you can listen to all of our podcasts from this season and others at www.twotext.com. But that is it for now. So until next time, goodbye.